For more on what to expect out of this meeting, we're joined now live by Harvey Lippman, a foreign policy expert and an advisory board member on the U.S. Agency for International Development's Partnership for Peace. Harley, thank you so much for being here to discuss. We're waiting now for that big moment, that handshake, more than a year in the making. I wanted to start by playing what President Biden said yesterday ahead of this meeting. Let's take a listen.
Trying to decouple from China. But what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better. From my perspective, if in fact the Chinese people who are in trouble right now economically, but I'm not going to continue to sustain the support for positions where if we want to invest in China, we have to turn over all our trade secrets.
Now, for those of us who don't follow foreign policy on a day-to-day basis watching this, what should we expect out of this meeting today? Big takeaways.
Well, there may be some agreements. The question is, are they real? Is this not just a show of where Xi Jinping has to show his people that he's engaged in diplomacy to keep stability in the world, and where Biden is certainly trying to improve relations, as was mentioned on your broadcast. There's no direct dialogue between the militaries of both nations. And you certainly want to avoid a miscalculation, which is the biggest threat of all. So you need to communicate. These are all positive and constructive actions. But the concern here is this a miscalculation on America's part? And what I mean by that is, while Biden is competing to coexist with Xi Jinping, China is competing to win. And that's the concern, that while the United States is trying to improve relations, be nice, so to speak, we want the status quo, China really is out for world domination, and they're just feigning a diplomatic discussion with the goal of fooling the United States and the West.
An important and interesting distinction that you make there. And something else that I read today that I thought was interesting that speaks to that point. Usually after these kinds of meetings between two nations, we see a joint leaders statement is released about what was talked about. But from what I've read, a lot of experts predict we're not going to see that today. Do you think that speaks to the fact that this is maybe a little bit more for show than for substance here?
That's the concern. It really is. It's like the fentanyl issue. Where is fentanyl coming from? It's coming from China. And look what it's doing. It's ravaging America. And the question is, will they do something about it? My concern is it like the fox guarding the henhouse? Unless you have strong guidelines and enforcement policies in place, I'm just worried that, the follow-up and the effectiveness of whatever was agreed to or we're looking to accomplish will just be lost.
Yeah, and you mentioned fentanyl. That's such a personal and incredibly important issue for families across the country who have lost someone to a fentanyl overdose. Do you think it is realistic that China is serious about stopping the flow of those chemicals that are used in making fentanyl out of the country? Or, as you said, do you think it's going to fall on the U.S. to put sanction against China or something else that would actually impact the fentanyl crisis here in the U.S.?
I think in diplomacy and international relations in general, you need a carrot and a stick, like in many things in life. And certainly you need to apply that here. I think China has to be able to have severe consequences if they don't pull it back. Like anything in life, people have good meetings and discussions, but everything is in the follow-up. We've all been to meetings, we had great discussions, but, things fall through the cracks. So I think the real challenge here is what happens the day after. And I think if they're serious about it, I think that's what we hope to see. What agreements and enforcement are put in place and what penalties are put in place against China if they don't stop the sending of fentanyl to the United States.
Now, we've put up on your screen a picture here of the crews that are waiting and watching as this moment about to happen, we will bring that moment to you live as soon as we see President Biden and the Chinese president come out to start their meeting today. But we wanted to bring you that live picture. We've got our crews out there, and we'll have live coverage all afternoon as this unfolds. Harley, want to ask you about another big issue that's going to be on the docket today that a lot of people are wanting some answers on: climate change. The U.S. and China yesterday announced a plan to ramp up the use of renewable energy. The plan is promising, but how do you enforce something like this?
Again, I think whether we use UN inspectors or the United States has the opportunity to inspect, going back to the opioid crisis, there's a prevailing theory that it came out of the laboratories of Wuhan. And yet we were never able to have transparency there. And that's a big issue. What we hope to come out of this is greater transparency on global issues, whether it be environmental issues or pandemics. That's a big challenge. But again, I think as long as we put in the right incentives and disincentives, I think it's important. What I want to add is that Biden said in his speech a moment ago that the Chinese people are suffering economically. And while that's true, the United States is doing better economically than China now. The danger of saying that is we could underestimate China vis-a-vis Taiwan and other issues. We could think, oh, well, China's really focused on improving the lives of their people. We should not let our guard down, because you could apply this to Russia. Russia's economy was collapsing, and yet they invaded Ukraine. So just because a country is having problems economically, that doesn't mean that they're going to avoid war and conflict.
There's certainly some interesting parallels there, and a fine line to walk here. As you said, the U.S. wants to be careful, but earlier in the week we heard Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen say our economy needs to function with China and figure out a way to cooperate with China. We can't exist at this point without China, so it will be certainly interesting to see what comes out of this meeting today, and if we possibly get that joint leaders statement. Foreign policy expert Harley Lippman, thank you so much for your input today. We'll bring you back the moment between the two leaders as soon as it happens. We'll be back after a quick break.